welcome to Lisa Unplugged. I'm Lisa, and today I've got something really special. I'm having a conversation with an extremely interesting person, and his name is Howie Robins, and he is the president and CEO of the Artificial Reef Society of British Columbia. This is the second time I've actually had a conversation with Howie. Now, due to the fact that we had technical issues and recording problems, he was very gracious enough to agree to do this again. This is an hour-long interview, and I am exceptionally grateful for Howie and for the Artificial Reef Society and all the information he's given us for this. So sit down, get a brew, relax, and listen in. This isn't the first time we've met, obviously. We had a few recording issues in the beginning, so we're back for a round two. Now, obviously, we had quite a lengthy discussion, and I quite enjoyed it. I took quite a lot away from what you'd originally said. And I went back and I watched some of the archive footage that's on YouTube. Obviously, I will be linking the Artificial Reef Society's YouTube channel into the description, because it's definitely worth a watch for those that, even after this conversation that we've had, don't understand what it is.
Sure.
And would like to know more. You know, I'd definitely like to put your website and the YouTube channel into the description so they can go and look for themselves. I obviously, like I said, we've spoke already, and you sent me the plans of. I am going to let you take over this bit in a minute, of the Sea King helicopter, which absolutely blew me away. So for those that have absolutely no idea what we're talking about, what is the Sea King helicopter and why are we talking about it?
Well, the Sea King helicopter is an iconic Canadian aircraft. Its design is modeled after, I believe it's fashioned and modeled after the American version and British version. There have been many iterations of it, but in the case of the former HMCS Annapolis, the Sea King was used as the ship's eyes and ears as an anti-submarine destroyer escort. And although it was a Navy ship, it was crewed by the Air Force, the Royal Canadian Air Force. So they retired the Sea King about 2 years or 3 years ago. And so we wanted to pay tribute to the vessel, to the aircraft, and we also wanted to create a little bit more habitat capacity on the open area of the flight deck of the ship that we sank in. Of the Annapolis that we sank in 2015. And so it seemed obvious that if we can recreate to scale in a skeletal format the Sea King, the CH-124 Sea King copter, then we can then lower it to the flight deck and have it anchored there and let it live on as a tribute to the vessel and a tribute to the Sea King's history, and allow marine life to adapt to it, to its skeletal structure, and for divers to use it as a point of interest, perhaps an area for a photo op, and just to enjoy the overall sculptural structure, which is, for us, different. A different means of an amplification project on an already existing artificial reef.
Now, obviously, we spoke in the original interview, and you told me about an idea that somebody come up with about putting a box in where the pilot's seat should be. For obviously a photo opportunity for somebody to be on the outside of the frame of the helicopter to take a picture. Somebody that thought about that has actually, obviously you're a diver yourself, and as a diver you thought about what other divers will want to do. So it's not so much an idea of what other divers want to do. It's what you want to do. So if you want to do it, everybody else wants to do it, surely.
Yeah, it's it's just from experience, just sort of looking many steps ahead about, how would the divers behave in a structure like that? Aside from viewing it from the outside and taking the photo images of it, it's a rather large aircraft. It's 55 feet long. It's going to be at least 16 feet high. You can convert that into meters. It's a pretty interesting structure, but we made the decision that divers can go in from one point to the other in its skeletal design, but inherently, I know that they're going to go to the front of the aircraft, and when you're wearing a scuba tank, you can't really sit in a in a seat. Even if we were to fabricate a seat, you can't do that. So we said, let's get rid of the idea of a seat, and we'll just put a small structural steel box anchored to the frame, and then a diver can come in and just kneel on it. And at that point, their head would be at pretty much the same position as the pilot might be, or the co-pilot. And that therein lies the photo op, and to hold on to a structure that's designed so that the diver isn't actually touching the exoskeleton of the helicopter, which is basically the area of biodiversity adhesion. So you don't want to be destructing or destroying any of the surface area that's already been colonized in terms of biodiversity.
Yeah. Now, a question that came to me after we'd spoke about the Sea King helicopter. Obviously, the way that it's being designed, how long would it last? What's the life expectancy of it?
Well, the materials will be made of benign steel. It's going in an area that's not subject to significant adverse weather conditions. So it's difficult to say, but it's not unrealistic to say that the structure will maintain itself for 50 to 60 years. Some parts of it may degrade. Nonetheless, it still remains, part of the artificial reef system. And we've known that with many of our other ships too. Some parts can fall off, perhaps lighter structures on the exterior. Nonetheless, a ship will hold its structural design for generations, for decades, really.
I do have a question that's just come to me as we've been talking. Have you had any of your reefs collapse?
None of our reefs have ever collapsed, and that's primarily due to the construction of these proud Canadian warships. They're very rugged, they're strong, there's longevity in their structure, and again, we don't put them in areas that are prone to hurricanes or tsunami weather or anything that would move the ship in any degree. Certainly, as I say, certain antennas or high points could fall off, but that's just simple degrading, but nothing significant.
So I'm guessing, obviously, where the reefs are situated, let's call it, there is no risk of any adverse. Obviously, the weather can't be predicted, but I'm guessing you don't deal with tsunamis and hurricanes and waterspouts or anything else for that matter.
No. And when we create these artificial reefs, we want to maintain the exterior of the ship as original as possible. Although there is some value in removing some particular components that could go towards salvage to help finance a project, it's always been our sort of code of ethics that we want to keep the exterior of the ship as true as possible. So we don't harvest any of the infrastructure that's kind of the sex appeal of diving on a warship.
Yeah.
And to the extent that even some of the railings are always left on board throughout, and other structures are kept on board. But we also take a lot of consideration on the inside of the ship when they're being prepared, not just for adaptation by various species of fish and other invertebrate creatures, but also, the scuba dive route. What would the scuba diver route look like? Where are the entry points? Where are the exit points? How far do we separate these points to provide for reasonable ambient light? Because the Canadian model of artificial reefing is designed to cater to intermediate, novice, and advanced scuba divers, all levels of scuba diving, which is attributed to eco-adventure dive tourism, which is all about development for communities to add more revenue to their economic base. Yeah. So when we walk the decks of these ships, we are constantly thinking about where would we remove walls, where do we want to punch open walls, and what walls do we think might indeed collapse in the sinking process due to the hydrostatic pressure of water rushing in. And so there's a little bit of science that we play into this as well, as it relates to the dynamics of a ship sinking. And when the Annapolis went down, it was the fastest sinking we have ever had. The ship was down on the seafloor in 2 minutes.
Wow.
2 minutes, completely submerged in 2 minutes, sitting upright in 100 feet of water. So you could just imagine the forces of water entering the ship and the amount of air leaving the ship. And there's a balance between the two that must be met. If they're not, you may not get a ship that's sitting upright. So there's a lot of thought and consideration into how the ship is prepared as it relates to the venting plan.
So here's a question. I'm guessing you were on site when the Annapolis went down.
Yeah.
How far away were you from it?
Excuse me. Well, we have a command boat, and the command boat has the necessary individuals on that boat, and we also have our demolition experts with us, and so they have the trigger switch, and so we're very close to the ship when we blow it, and but the explosions take place underwater, not above water. But as soon as we've made as soon as we hit the switch, we basically back off and then just watch the ship sink from there. But I would say we're about maybe 100 yards away.
Oh wow! So closer than I expected then.
Yeah.
In our first interview, obviously, I said to you, I want to be that person that presses that big red button. Obviously, it's not a big red button, but the principle still stands. I still want to press that big red button. There's obviously more to sinking a ship than just sinking a ship. You know, you said it yourself, you've got to work out, obviously, what the water's going to do once it comes in, what walls you can take out. So, for those that are kind of listening to this going, hang on a minute, what are they talking about? Let's talk about the Annapolis. What happened? Let's start from the beginning. How did you acquire the ship?
Well, we've embarked on a program working with the Canadian Navy on the West Coast to who were decommissioning a number of their post-war destroyer escorts, vessels that were built in the 60s. These were vessels that were the most high-tech vessels of their day, very, very fast war vessels, 366 feet long. But many of them were constructed of, tubes and resistors and old electronics. Compared to today's high-tech computer technology, they were destined basically for decommissioning. And so we appealed to the Canadian Navy to say, well, work with us and we can provide marine habitat using the hulk of the vessel after extensive environmental remediation. And we would place them in strategic areas along the British Columbia coast to develop eco-adventure dive tourism and to enhance areas of marine diversity that were in need of substantial superstructure or complex habitat where one doesn't exist. So it was very successful, and so the Annapolis was the very last vessel on the West Coast that we were able to repurpose, and it's all about reusing and repurposing. And so effectively we can say with confidence that we sank the West Coast Queen's Navy. We say that very often, and we joke about it. But we were successful. We've got 9 major artificial reefs in British Columbia right now. One of them is a Boeing 737 passenger jet, which was decommissioned many years ago, and that was our first aircraft that we sank, and it's doing very well. But when we acquired the Annapolis, we had to go through the same detailed regime of environmental cleaning, preparing it, going through all the regulatory requirements in order to receive a permit for disposal. We also work with our Department of Fisheries and Oceans to ensure that when we sink a ship, it doesn't contravene the Fisheries Act or the Species at Risk Act, so we pay attention to that. We have to justify just about everything we do with government. Yeah. In terms of navigation issues, we have to satisfy the requirements of Transport Canada as it relates to safe navigation above the wreck site, and so we take that into account as well. And once all these details are reviewed carefully, we also ensure that we're speaking with local interest parties, particularly our First Nations community, that they're happy with what we're doing, that they see the value in converting ships into marine habitat. Yeah. And they like the idea of a nonprofit organization using these vessels to enhance areas that might have been damaged through years of log booming, and putting something down in the ocean that would actually regenerate the type of marine life that used to be there many years ago.
So this brings me on to the next point of questioning, which we had a list of questions. Does an artificial reef help the economy?
Yes, it does. It helps the economy because it drives eco-adventure dive tourism to the area. And wreck diving is a different discipline that one needs to be trained for. So although one could be what's considered an open water diver, you do have to have wreck training to enter inside a wreck, as much as you would need specialized training for ice diving or cave diving. So for the scuba dive stores, it gives them an opportunity to sell training courses for wreck diving. That drives their economy. There are charter operators who bring divers to these sites, and there are hotels and restaurants that cater to divers who are coming in from out of town. And so, yes, it's anyone who's connected in the marine industry that has anything to do with scuba diving or charter operations do benefit from this. So there is a spin-off, and you can calculate it depending on working with the charter operators and calculating how many divers they take out. But there's no question about it that it does drive tourism. Divers like novelty, and when you sink a vessel to code, nothing is more exciting than scuba diving on a sunken vessel.
It's like a new toy, isn't it, for a diver?
Yeah, it's intoxicating. It's really something, and they take on an immensity underwater that you can't spend enough time exploring all the different areas in and around the vessel. And for many people, it becomes an opportunity to train on photography. People who are learning how to scuba dive and take video images or still pictures, they use these artificial reefs for practice. Indeed, the Canadian Coast Guard actually uses the Annapolis for search and rescue techniques. So there's many applications that an artificial reef can cater to on the commercial level as well.
Do they have to have permission to? I know obviously they've got to have training on it, but do they have to have permission to dive on your sites, or can they just go out and do it?
In Canada, no permission is required. It's dive at your own leisure, dive at your own risk, and there's no restrictions. There's no park fees. Anybody can tie up to a float connected to one of our reefs and enjoy the dive and come out with some great memories.
So, what was the last artificial reef you dived on yourself?
Well, the most recent ship I was on was up in an area called Powell River, where we sank a 355-foot American-built concrete tanker. And we sank the ship in 2018, but due to COVID, we couldn't get back to the ship until everybody was in good standing health-wise. Yeah. But we went to look at the ship as early as September of last year, and we're quite surprised at the rate of biodiversity that had already adapted to the concrete structure. It was quite satisfying to know that you were looking at rockfish and lingcod, whether you look right or left, they were there. Wow. And they were there in juvenile state. They were in the early life cycle of their lifespan. So when you see that sort of thing happening, you come away saying, yeah, this is good. You know, you're building their condominiums, you're building their homes, yeah. and you know, the currents will continue to deposit all this embryonic material onto the vessel in perpetuity, so that every time we visit the ship, we'll just see more evidence of birth, growth, and mortality of successive generations of marine life, invertebrates, plant life. Plant life is extremely important on our artificial reefs because they convert CO2. They carbon capture CO2 from the atmosphere and they convert it through photosynthesis. That's right. So that's a useful benefit as well. The ship is called it's known as the YOGN-82.
So, obviously, leading on from what you've just said, did COVID affect the Artificial Reef Society?
Well, it did, to the extent that we really couldn't carry on with operations in person. Although I will say that when you're out on the water in an open boat, it wasn't so much of an issue because you could still dive. One just wears their mask until they're ready, a filter mask until you're ready to put on your scuba mask. So, in terms of the charter operators, they were still operating for the most part. Um, but we really weren't engaged in operations as it was relating to organizing with potential clients. So what we were doing in that period was just negotiating and working towards future projects, knowing that eventually COVID would abate and so on. And
Did
we
it
have a number
affect any of the projects?
No, there was no effect on the projects directly as a result of COVID.
Oh, that's brilliant news. Absolutely brilliant news. So what's next for the Artificial Reef Society? What have you got coming up?
Well, we're looking at a number of options right now, working with potential industrial clients who have surplus vessels that they're looking to find a solution for.
Would any of them be in Britain by any chance?
Well, at the moment, we're concentrating on in Canada, but certainly whatever we do is scalable outside of Canada too, because we're taking the fundamentals with us. And the disposal at sea regulations are pretty much universal, so we know what they are to code. But one of the things that we do look at is the viability of different ships in different areas. Where would they go? What type of ship is it? What is it constructed of? And we provide a solution, an opportunity for organizations who are looking for perhaps another alternative to scrapping. One of the benefits of sinking a ship as an artificial reef is that there is a significant amount of scrapping that does occur. This happens naturally through the remediation process, where typically large parts of machineries, auxiliary engines, anything that has anything to do with electrical systems, motors are all purposely removed. Very often they can be resold, or they indeed go back into recycling. So there's a large degree of recycling that occurs in an artificial reef. But fundamentally, once that has met all the criteria, what's left is basically the hulk of the vessel, just the skeletal version of it, which is a benign structure. And that is the complex habitat that is repurposed, reused in the marine environment. One of the other benefits of this, of reefing a ship, is that once the environmental regulations have been met, there's really no further need to tear the ship down to the last ton of steel. And therein lies the savings of the tremendous environmental footprint that tearing a ship apart occurs. When you tear a ship apart, there's so much carbon pollution in transport, machinery, tearing it apart. And you don't have that when you prepare a ship for artificial reefing, because much of that is just not necessary. And so there's another spin-off benefit. And of course, that comes down to the reducing all the labor costs as well.
Yeah.
So right now we're looking at various options. We're working with a company that may be looking to expand the artificial reef projects in Powell River, where we sank the YOG in 82. They have 9 more ships to deal with, and they're looking to the Artificial Reef Society to carry on the program there beginning this year.
Only a few ships then, just a small amount. So I can see somebody else asking this question while they're listening into this or watching this. What's the reason for pulling all the wiring out?
Well, it's an environmental regulation as it relates to copper. Copper is not a friendly metal in the marine environment, and so any copper that exists in the machinery must be stripped out. And there's indeed a tremendous amount of copper wiring throughout a war vessel or any vessel. And so that is purposely removed and indeed recycled. So there is value in the copper, and that value is converted into monetary value, and that could go towards the project costs to help in the project costs.
So let's go back to the Annapolis. What is the cost of stripping it down and sinking it, roughly?
It's difficult to really pinpoint because there's so many facets to that. Um, I think the best way to really equate the cost of converting an artificial reef uh, is really dependent on its. I suppose the best way to answer that question is what would be the cost or the estimated cost to scrap the ship entirely,
Yeah.
and then look at the comparison of reefing a ship. Um, and so one of the things that we know is that when we look at asbestos as an example, okay, asbestos is a harmful material um, for humans to breathe in.
Of course.
So if you were to scrap a vessel entirely, the abatement of asbestos has to be taken into account and its cost
Yeah, of course,
for
yeah.
environmental removal.
Yep.
So there's a numeric value that goes into that, and that's really scalable depending on the size of the ship. Well, in an artificial reef project, there's no need to remove asbestos, but it has no effect in the marine environment. It is inert, it's benign, so
Right.
it can go down with the ship safely. The only thing is you have to just make sure that if there's any broken asbestos, it needs to be buttoned up or sealed up in some degree. So when you calculate an issue like that, you can see that the cost savings are dramatic, as an example.
It's definitely cheaper to sink a ship than to completely recycle it. You said it yourself earlier. With obviously not just in money but in carbon footprint, because to take out obviously the wiring, it's manpower and everything else, but then to take down the steel structures, obviously bit by bit, it's got to be machinery. Unless you've got somebody that can pick up 25 tons worth of steel and walk off with it, it's not going to happen. It's got to be machinery. So in my head, and I'm hoping you're going to confirm this, it is cheaper to reef it, but it also helps the environment in the same way. So you're gaining two really good objectives there.
Well, that's right. And of course, the economic value behind it too. These ships get to live on as a second life.
Of course,
and
yeah.
so if you'd served on a proud warship or a commercial vessel, those who served on these ships like the idea of their ships living on as living laboratories for study, knowing that they're contributing to the marine environment and that there's a responsible organization who knows all the nuances, not just to sink them, but to meet the rigors of environmental excellence at the same time. And so you're really providing a win-win-win situation all the way around.
Most definitely.
And so we always consider ourselves as the option. Now, that's not to say that every ship should be artificial reefed. Some ships are not conducive to being reefed as an artificial habitat. If they are constructed primarily of wood, we wouldn't consider that because we would say that wood is not considered a long-term stable material.
No, absolutely not. Eventually breaks down.
Right. And nor would we want to sink vessels that are made of fiberglass. We really prefer vessels that are primarily made of steel.
The good old-fashioned vessels. That's what we're talking about. The good old-fashioned ones.
Steel or aluminum, things that we know can, vessels that we know would stand up to the marine environment.
What's the lifespan of any of the ships, or even the plane that you've sank, roughly?
Well, I think some of these ships can live on for 100 to 150 years without collapsing, if not more.
Again, within the costing of all this, you've got 100 years worth of putting money back into the economy.
Well, absolutely. I mean, even if some of these ships were to degrade in some capacity, nonetheless, they remain viable artificial reefs. The trick for us in our group is we want to ensure that when we sink a vessel, that we're doing it in a fashion so that the ship remains upright on the seafloor, which helps the orientation for a scuba diver to know where they are on the ship or to understand where they are. But nature will do it once, and if you prepare the ship properly, it ought to go down that way. But there's nothing wrong with it, listing a few degrees to port or starboard. That just adds more interest to it.
Yeah.
And and there it is, the beginning of a new artificial reef. And the path to colonization occurs in two ways. It's the current that deposits all this embryonic material onto the vessel and gets lodged in nooks and crannies throughout the complex structure. And then you've got those creatures that crawl on the seafloor freely and then suddenly come up against a large substrate, and they just sort of find their way onto the vessel's superstructure, and they're either breeding or they're being preyed upon. But we find a variety of areas of the ship that provide shelter and habitat and areas for breeding, and hopefully they're not overfished or fished at all. We don't find fishing on our artificial reefs as common, and so they are their own sustaining ecosystems. Some of our ships that we sank back in the 90s, we consider mature artificial reefs. Yeah. Mature in that we see species of rockfish and lingcod that are just known entities there. We assume that they're dining in and not dining out. But they are self-sustaining artificial reefs, and they're just mimicking a natural reef, but not next to a natural reef, somewhat away from it in a more open seafloor area.
From the original conversation we had, your ships tend to be sank in specific locations that are away pretty much nothing on the seafloor. Is that right?
Yeah, well, we look for areas that are rather flat and featureless, that don't have any significant reef structures beyond the height of the common share. So by putting in a large vessel, it kind of traps, and broadside it could sort of capture whatever's in the current onto its structure. And that's how you get sort of a hairy haze on it after a little while, sort of what we call the diatom mat, and those are the building blocks of an artificial reef. You get small filter feeders and plant life that adheres to the structure. That brings in different species of fish. Plus the fact that these ships have height and scale and various designs and shapes, so they're just perfect tools of opportunity for habitat.
Do you measure the biodiversity on your reefs? Is there a way of doing that? Do you do that?
We do that. Yes, we do. In the case of the Annapolis, once we sank the ship, which was in a BC provincial marine park, we embarked on a marine study known as Project ABIS, ABIS, and that stands for Annapolis Biodiversity Index Study. This was an initiative by the Reef Society in cooperation with citizen science, those divers who are handy and skilled with a video camera or still camera. And over 5 years since the ship went down, these divers would go to the ship and be directed to go to specific areas and videotape or photograph whatever animals, plant life they see in a given area. Then that information is provided to a marine taxonomist who is experienced in identifying different species of invertebrate and fish. And they create the taxonomy based on that weekend's dive. And we did this for over a 5-year period, mostly to show the efficacy of ship-to-reef projects in holding and retaining, capturing various biodiversity. And the report is finished now. It's on our website. And it's a good report. It shows strong evidence of net gain in biodiversity over net loss. Yeah. There's really no negative effect of sinking an artificial reef so long as it's done to code and all the parameters are met. So in the study, there were 10 categories of marine biota that were counted, right down to sponges. And they're all showing up on the Annapolis. Every one of our ships has a different biological personality because they were all sunk in different times, so some are older than others. But bringing the Annapolis to Vancouver was the perfect situation because it allowed us to put the ship in an area that could be accessible literally 15 minutes from downtown. So, or not far from downtown, from a ferry terminal. So we have easy access to the ship, 20 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes to the site. We could do our dives, get all the data we want, and then come home in the late morning and cut your grass. So it became a focal point. It also provided a task for divers, something to do on the ship, and hone in on their skills. So it was very, very good. And we'll continue to do this with other projects as well.
So you quite literally get in your car, drive 15 minutes, get on a boat, 15 minutes out, and you're on the wreck.
Pretty much. The type of wreck that you would hope to see in the South Pacific is right there in our backyard.
At least it gives you something to do on a Sunday morning when you're bored.
Well, that's right. It's, the divers like it because they're tasks. They have tasks to do. And there are other tasks to do. There's actually some maintenance we do on these ships too. You have to maintain the floats and the lines, keep them clean for diver use. We have two innovation. We have one innovation on the Annapolis, known as a safety stop station. They're on our website too. These are aluminum structures that we have on the line at 15 feet below the surface. And these are the points of decompression locations for divers who are conducting a decompression stage. And so they can separate themselves from each other without all gathering on the same line. So we like to step up the product as we sink ships. We like to add more capacity to them. We add more value. We open the ships up in different ways. The Annapolis has one of the most interesting features compared to the others in that even if you are not a trained, certified wreck diver, it won't prevent you from seeing what the engine room looks like because we opened up the side where the engine and boiler room is.
Wow.
So you could look inside with your lights and you could see the machinery spaces in there. And if you're skilled enough, if you have the training, you could actually enter into these areas safely. And you could see ambient light on the other side of the engine room. So you can swim around it, observe it, see what marine life is in there, and then come out to the other side or carry on into the boiler room. So the dive route is very, very carefully calculated, depending on the ship. And
so it's not just in that door and out that door, it's in that door and around the world before you can that's fantastic. It's a playground for divers. That's exactly what you've done. You've created a playground for divers.
Well, the fundamental difference between sinking a ship ad hoc compared to what the Artificial Reef Society does is that we have a game plan. This is a plan that involves economic development. It involves finance planning. It involves environmental remediation excellence. It involves a number of issues, all taken into account. And fundamentally, we're creating a dive experience designed by divers for divers. And therein lies the difference between just getting rid of something for the purpose of getting rid of it. And they get to live on this way as useful tools.
Yeah. If you could sink anything, you had an option to sink anything, what would it be?
Yeah, well, there are many different types of vessels of a different construct. Ferries are very interesting vessels, much less complicated than a warship. Nonetheless, complicated systems, but they're just different in size. And if one knows a ferry, I mean, it's not hard to imagine, if you travel on ferries, sort of how they're constructed, or you know where their passageways are. So they're kind of identifiable. Warships are different because you really don't know the layout. But ferries offer the same interest value and the same marine habitat value because they are large and complex vessels. So ferries would be good. Small freighters are good too. That's why we carefully just look at, the value of putting down a vessel. Is it going to do the type of job we would expect it to do?
Yeah.
How complicated would it be to do it? What we would never bother with, I could tell you, would be cruise ships or aircraft carriers. They're just far too complex.
Yeah.
Typically, aircraft carriers are sunk by usually the navies themselves. The Americans will sink their aircraft carriers. They wouldn't really be available to a civilian operation. They are just too enormous in scope. And, the cost of preparing an artificial reef as a carrier as an artificial reef is beyond the scope of most organizations anyway.
Yeah.
So cruise ships are much the same. They're just too complicated, too many rooms, too many cavities. They have to be sunk really deep. So we try and sink our ships within recreational dive limits.
Which are what?
About 130 feet or around 33 meters, more or less. Although it's okay if they go down a little bit deeper because there are specialized gases for that type of thing. And we know that technical divers like to go in deep on these ships. One of our ships, the former agency is Cape Breton, over 450 feet long, very, very, very large ship. And you could dive down into the engine room. It's almost diving down like 6 stories into the ship,
Wow.
if not 7. So it's a deep, deep dive, and not all divers would do that. So most divers will hang out on the periphery, where there's lots of light and lots of marine life. But it's the tech divers that'll go deep, and that's fine.
Yeah.
If they want to go.
So the deepest reef you've got is?
Well, to my recollection, I think our deepest one is about 150 feet. Not sure what that converts to in meters, but typically...
We work on feet, you're all right. We can work with feet.
Yeah, typically we try and sink our ships within about 100 feet, so that there's so much superstructure above that. So, as I say, we try to cater to intermediate, novice, and advanced divers.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the Boeing is only in 90 feet of water?
The Boeing 737 is in about 93 feet of water, and it's sitting on a cradle system. So it's actually in a horizontal position, 10 feet above the seafloor. So it's actually, you could actually dive underneath the airframe, and you can go into the cargo area. You can go out through the main passenger cabin, so you can penetrate the airplane. And that's a good example of a known structure. If you've been on an airplane, you kind of know there's 2 exits forward, there's 2 exits back.
That's right.
Well, we tell the same thing. If you need to get out of the airplane, it's the same thing. But it's an interesting structure because it's known. It's a lighter material, but we expect an airframe can last, up to 60 or 80 years.
Wow.
If it's in an area that's not prone to, adverse weather conditions that could toss it around, because it is a much lighter structure.
Yeah, of course.
And to my last recollection, there's about 110 species on the passenger list on that vessel.
Really?
Yeah. So.
Wow. Have you been down to the Boeing?
Well, not lately, but we're planning it this year. We're going to go and have a look at how she's behaving and have a look at the biodiversity on the vessel inside and out. And we'll be taking some video and adding to our archives. We'll be doing a number of dives back to our earlier ships just to sort of catch up on on how well they're performing.
So what are the Artificial Reef looking forward to this year?
We're just waiting right now to receive our park use permit for the Seeking helicopter project, so we can proceed forward with that this year and carefully lower her down to the flight deck of the Annapolis. The concrete ships in Powell River that need disposal is a project that we anticipate will restart. It stopped mainly because the ownership of the mill, it's actually at a mill site, was under sale, and COVID came around, so everything kind of stopped there. We think that'll restart this year. And we're talking to other people within Canada and outside of Canada about surplus vessels that they're looking to find solutions for.
So you've got a busy diary then, really?
Yes, yeah, we're busy, and everybody's interested in what the reefing can do and how it can help them, and we're happy to provide our expertise.
So what made you start the Artificial Reef Society? Because I know you're one of the original founders.
Well, there was a group of divers who were part of an organization known as the Archaeological Society of British Columbia. And the Archaeological Society of British Columbia is a group of volunteer divers who would be partially subsidized by the government and would go out and research and discover BC heritage shipwrecks. So these are mostly wooden vessels throughout the province. And it's all about archaeology and conservation and discovery of where some of these ships are.
Yeah, of course.
But very often, the ships that were sunk in shallow waters are sort of beaten down to death. There's very little left of them, save for a few angle irons and this or that, or perhaps you'd be lucky enough to find a wreck that hadn't been discovered that actually has some artifacts that are worth saving and keeping. And all this is conservation. No, it's not for the taking. So we, some of us thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we saw what was going on in America with artificial reefs? And there was some attention paid to what was going on in New Jersey and Dade County, South Florida, what they were doing with artificial reefs. And
was this the subway cars by any chance?
Yes, yeah. They were throwing all kinds of things in the water for what was known as FADs, FADS, which are fish attracting devices. But the idea of throwing washing machines in or subway cars or buses didn't really appeal to us. It seemed like it was throwing garbage in the ocean, even though they provided habitat to some degree. They're not really long-lived because the metals are just too thin, not really suitable for the marine environment. So we thought, well, if we can get a ship here as a pilot project through some means, we could use it as a test program for future projects to come. So the focus started moving towards acquiring vessels for the purpose of dive tourism and marine eco or biodiversity. And as we got smarter and working with larger ships, we were paying more attention to the positive effects that these ships were providing for the marine environment. So our focus quickly changed to paying more attention to the needs of the marine environment in conservation purposes, and providing a helping hand to a marine environment that was under stress through overfishing or other environmental stresses. And but at the same time, not losing our focus on the enjoyment of it, for diver purposes as well. And we got very good at this. We got very good at our planning, got very good at the design concept and working with others. It provided communities with a purpose, and it stimulated the entire dive community to the extent that we have a large population of Americans from Washington State and Oregon State on the West Coast who purposely travel to British Columbia to dive on the ships, adding more American dollars to our economy too. So definitely a lot of spin-off benefits. And so that kind of, it built from one ship to another. No one really thought it would go beyond one ship, but we had the right people in place. And one of them, a dear friend of mine, recently passed away, was well connected with politicians in Ottawa. And so he was skilled and able to negotiate with the Canadian Navy to have the Navy live on here on the West Coast. And these ships went down with great respect, great dignity, and with a proud salute.
Yeah, I can understand that. Why is it the Artificial Reef Society of British Columbia and not just the Artificial Reef Society of Canada?
I guess the answer to that is we simply started here, and we're kind of known across Canada. We're known outside of Canada too. Perhaps that's a question, our board of directors can address down the road. But the work that we do is, even though, we don't have the Artificial Reef Society of Canada today, the interesting thing is whatever we do is scalable.
Yeah.
Today the Reef Society is acting in the capacity as consultants. Okay, so we've made a change in our business profile after our last artificial reef sinking project rather, simply because the economics of ownership of the vessel in our case was not very viable any longer. So what we do is we now have enough proprietary knowledge and skill ourselves working with our subcontractors that we can now consult on the ethical conversion of a vessel, no matter where it is in the world.
Yeah.
And so what we impart is basically the skills, knowledge from beginning to end on the planning phase, the scope of work that needs to be done, the expectations that would occur, and being able to see the showstoppers in advance is critically important to potential clients who are looking at reefing as something different and new, and certainly an option. And we've been considered through many agencies within Canada, various federal agencies that have fleets of vessels too. So we're called upon for our expertise in consulting on the benefits or the what might be considered a showstopper or a problem or to that nature. But what I can say with confidence is that with whatever we've done, we've got 9 vessels underwater, which means that we had to ethically apply for 9 permits at the federal government level and sometimes at the provincial level, and indeed working with our First Nations friends. In the absence of having that, there would be no artificial reefs. So it goes to show that 9 applications resulted in 9 permit disposals. So we're very proud of that. We've never been denied a permit yet.
So you've obviously done something right.
Yeah, and it feels good too because there's a high confidence level with government. We hold very good office with them. They understand what we do. We justify what we do. We try to make their job easy because we provide all of the necessary details and information in advance based on our experience. And they understand, the benefits on many levels. Ecological benefits. I can go on and on and on. Marine habitat benefits and so on. It's just a known fact.
So one last question for you. Is there a particular reason why there's no cameras on the reefs that can be viewed 24 hours a day?
Yeah, well, we don't have cameras on the ships primarily because we don't have the water clarity.
Right, okay.
Okay, we just don't. Now, there are times of the year when visibility is extraordinarily good, usually in the winter times, when there's no water runoff into the sea.
When it's the most coldest bit.
It is colder, yeah. Now, that doesn't preclude the fact that we could not put lights on a vessel and have cameras running in time lapse. That's possible too, but it requires a lot of setup.
Yeah, of course.
It requires shore access to power. Lots of discussion was had about doing that sort of thing. If we had a ship in the Caribbean, or if we were sinking a ship anywhere in tropical waters where clarity is consistently good, no question about it, you can do it there. We just don't have the clarity here. Nonetheless, we do mount cameras on the ships when we sink them, which is an interesting point.
Oh, yeah.
We placed many cameras in different locations, and we learned where to put these cameras in relation to where the water's coming in, and also how fast the water's coming in. So, and it took a lot of planning, thought, considerations. Working with our experts, our demolition experts, and our marine architect, structural architect, to determine where the location of these explosives would go, how many there would be, how large the openings would be. And all this is really predicated on previous history, learning as we go. And now we've got the formula down pretty well.
Oh, yeah, most definitely. It's experience. It's years of experience. That's what, the instinct of getting it right is years of experience.
Yeah, it's knowing the structure of the vessel you're sinking and just understanding the venting plan and so on, and double checking and calculating the whole thing out. And it's not just by visual commentary. There's actually some mathematics that go into this too. There are a number of steps we take in advance before we sink a ship. The last 2 weeks of preparations are probably the most intense and interesting and exciting parts of a disposal process, because that's where it all takes place. So it gets to be these projects are infectious when it comes to wanting to be a part of it or actually witnessing it too. It's quite a show.
I can't wait to see what you're going to do next. I really can, and
Well,
I am
I really
exceptionally grateful once again for you taking the time to come back after we had so many issues. And again, it's been a very, very intriguing conversation.
I see. Well, it's a lot to impart, and there's a lot of information about what we do, and it is educational.
Most definitely, most definitely. Let's hope this makes people think about, obviously, the marine life, that what an artificial reef actually does. Let's hope this actually starts making people think more.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would just impart that any organization, whether it's a company or a government agency that has fleets of vessels and is in need of some solutions, the worst thing you could do is just sit on these ships indefinitely and have them sort of degrade, without a solution. My suggestion is look at reefing, look at artificial reefing, consider it as an option to the total scrapping of a vessel, and you might just come away with some viable plans that could be put into action as a long-term solution to help yourself and help the marine environment at the same time.
I absolutely 100% agree with you. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming back and spending time with me and telling us all about what you do and why you do it.
Great. Well, it was an honor to talk to you too. And thank you for looking us up. Okay, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Howie. Much appreciated.
All the best then.
Bye-bye.